Imagine this: you walk into work every day, trying to do your best, but there's someone in the office who makes your life miserable. They make you feel small, worthless, and like you don't belong. You've seen this person belittle others before, but this time, it's your turn. It's like a switch flips, and suddenly, everything changes. The once supportive environment now feels hostile, and your confidence is crushed with every cruel word and condescending look. What's worse? This isn't just a random coworker, it's your manager, the person who's supposed to support you, mentor you, and lead you to success. You start questioning yourself. You ask, why me? What did I do to deserve this? You try to brush it off, thinking it's just one of those things, hoping it will pass. But it doesn't. The bullying continues, and each day feels like a battle you're losing. Your colleagues notice the change in you, but no one says anything. They're afraid too. It's like a silent agreement among the group to stay quiet, to not rock the boat, even though they know it's wrong. At first, you feel powerless. How can you stand up to someone who has so much control over your career, your paycheck, and your future? It's a fight you never asked for, but suddenly it's become impossible to ignore. The injustice weighs on you, but you don't want to make a scene. You don't want to be seen as the troublemaker. But as days pass, the anger inside you starts to grow. You feel like you have to do something. But what? Then, something unexpected happens. You decide it's time to stand up. Not just for yourself, but for the others who've silently suffered in the shadows, afraid to speak out. You begin to fight back not with anger, but with something far more powerful. The response you give in that moment will shock everyone, including your manager. It's a response that not only challenges the system of bullying that's been allowed to thrive, but one that sets in motion a chain of events that no one saw coming. How does someone who's been pushed to the edge by unfair treatment find the strength to rise above it? What drives a person to take that first step towards standing up for themselves and others? And what happens when this individual's surprising response begins to shift the power dynamic? This is a story about courage, resilience, and the unexpected ways that people can change the course of their own lives and the lives of those around them. But just when you think you know what's going to happen next, the plot twists. The manager reacts in a way no one could have predicted. And the consequences of that moment, well, they're still unfolding. Will this be the moment when the workplace finally starts to change? Or will it be the final straw that forces a decision no one is prepared to face? Stay tuned, because the next part of the story is about to reveal a truth so powerful it could change everything for everyone involved. You won't believe what happens next. The office was a place where routine felt safe. People followed their tasks like clockwork, going through the motions, keeping their heads down. Most of the time, there wasn't much drama, just deadlines, meetings, and the occasional coffee break with colleagues. But for one employee, the atmosphere had started to shift in an unsettling way. At first, it was subtle. A passing comment here, a lingering look there. The manager, who had always seemed like a straightforward, if slightly distant, figure, had begun to take a more personal interest in the employee's work, or rather, their mistakes. Small errors that once would have been overlooked were suddenly magnified. The tone of feedback was sharp, harsh even, and it was delivered in a way that made the employee feel exposed, like they were being singled out in front of the entire team. The manager's criticism wasn't constructive, it was biting and personal. Over time, the criticism grew more frequent, more intense. The once quiet manager, who would often sit in their office behind closed doors, began to hover, always lurking near the desk, watching with a scrutinizing eye. The employee tried their best to meet expectations. They worked late, volunteered for extra tasks, tried to impress. But nothing seemed to be good enough. And every time they failed, the manager was there, ready to pounce with a comment that cut deeper than the last. The other colleagues in the office began to notice, but no one spoke up. They saw the way the manager treated the employee, how they publicly dismissed their ideas in meetings or make snide remarks about their performance. But they were all too afraid of being next. Fear of becoming the target kept them silent, complicit in the bullying, even if they didn't agree with it. The workplace, which once felt like a second home, now felt suffocating, like walking on eggshells every single day. The employee, once full of ambition and energy, started to shrink. Their shoulders sagged, their smile faded. They began to dread coming into work, counting the minutes until they could leave. Every email from the manager felt like an attack, every conversation a trap. The sense of isolation grew. The company, which had once felt like a place of opportunity, now seemed like a cold, indifferent machine, where only a few held the power and the rest were left to suffer in silence. It wasn't until the employee had to make a presentation in a meeting that the full extent of the bullying became apparent. The project they'd been working on had been a labor of love, hours spent refining every detail, making sure it would be perfect. But when it was their time to present, the manager cut them off before they could even get to the main points. The feedback was brutal, harsh, and public. The manager humiliated them in front of the entire team, ridiculing every part of the project, undermining the work they had poured so much effort into. The room was silent after the manager finished speaking, and the employee could feel every eye in the room on them. Their face burned with shame, but they didn't speak. They couldn't. The words they had prepared seemed to disappear, like they'd never existed at all. They felt small. Less than. But even in that moment, a tiny spark of anger began to grow. It was something unfamiliar, something buried deep inside them for so long, but now it was emerging. That night, they didn't go home and just stew in their frustration. Instead, they sat down and wrote. Not just about the incident, but about everything. The past months, the weight of the manager's words, the way they felt as if they were being broken down piece by piece. They wrote about the silence of their coworkers, the way they had been complicit in allowing the bullying to continue, and how they had allowed themselves to become invisible. But as they wrote, something changed. Their anger shifted into determination. They realized they didn't have to take this anymore. They had the power to stand up for themselves, to speak out, to say enough was enough. But even with that clarity, they still didn't know what to do next. They considered going to HR, but the thought of facing the manager's wrath was terrifying. What if they lost their job? What if they were blamed for causing trouble? But the more they thought about it, the more they realized that silence wasn't going to protect them. If anything, it was enabling the situation to continue. The next day, when the manager called them into their office for another one-on-one, the employee felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in their stomach. They walked into the office, trying to keep their composure, even though their heart was racing. The manager didn't waste any time getting to the point. They started talking about the presentation, picking apart every little detail, pointing out all the supposed flaws in the work. But this time, the employee didn't just sit there. They didn't just nod and agree. Instead, they calmly interrupted the manager. "I've been trying to improve, I've been putting in the effort, and I've been doing everything I can to meet expectations," they said, their voice surprisingly steady. "But the way you've been treating me isn't okay. It's not just about the work, it's personal, and it's hurtful." For a moment, the manager's face flashed with surprise, and then annoyance. They leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. "You think you can talk to me like that?" They snapped, their tone darkening. "You're lucky to even have this job." The employee didn't back down. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "I'm not lucky to have this job. I've earned it. And I deserve respect." The manager stood up abruptly, walking around the desk. "You're out of line," they growled, their voice low and threatening. But instead of cowering, the employee stood their ground, refusing to let the intimidation work this time. They knew it wasn't just their own dignity on the line now, it was the dignity of everyone who had silently watched this injustice happen. The manager paused for a long moment, as if considering their next move. The tension in the room was palpable. The employee could feel their pulse quicken, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. But the manager didn't speak right away. They just stared, their face hardening with anger. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they finally spoke. "You'll regret this." The words hung in the air, heavy with a promise of retaliation. But the employee didn't flinch. They weren't afraid anymore. They had taken the first step, and no matter what happened next, they knew they had to keep moving forward. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Why was this manager behaving like this? What was motivating them to target this one employee so relentlessly? What had started as a simple issue of unfair treatment had now become something far more sinister. The employee couldn't let it go. There had to be more to the story, something that explained why manager had chosen them as target. As the day wore on, the employee couldn't stop thinking about the manager's words, the threat they had left hanging in air. Would they really retaliate? Would they escalate things further? Or was this just another bluff to intimidate them into silence? No one in the office had ever seen anyone stand up to the manager before. They all knew power manager wielded, and they knew the price of defiance. It made the employee wonder, was this going to be the catalyst for something bigger? Something that would shake up the entire office, maybe even company. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: the manager had underestimated the employee. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The days after the confrontation with the manager felt different. The office, once a place of routine, now felt like a battlefield, every hallway and meeting room charged with an electric tension. The employee couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the manager, but by everyone else. The colleagues who had once smiled and exchanged pleasantries now avoided eye contact. The silence that followed them everywhere was thick, oppressive. They knew what everyone was thinking. Who does this person think they are, challenging the manager like that? But the employee couldn't bring themselves to care about what others thought anymore. They had stood up for themselves, and that alone felt like a small victory. Still, there was a gnawing uncertainty, a sense that this was just the beginning. The manager's words echoed in their mind, "You'll regret this." What exactly did that mean? Was the manager going to go after their career? Would they sabotage their projects, spread rumors, or worse, make them next target for even harsher treatment? They didn't know, but the fear was there, simmering just beneath the surface. But there was another feeling, too, one that was stronger than the fear. It was the feeling of not backing down. It had taken everything inside them to find the courage to speak up, to confront the injustice head on. Now, they had to deal with consequences, whatever they might be. The days that followed were filled with little moments of doubt and small victories. In meetings, the manager's sharp remarks continued, but this time, the employee wasn't afraid to speak up, to correct the misinterpretations, to defend their work. The tension was thick, but each time they stood their ground, it was like the invisible chains that had bound them were loosening, one link at a time. Still, the manager's presence loomed like a shadow, their eyes always watching, always judging. There were moments when the employee wondered if they were making things worse. Was this the right choice? Would speaking out only cause more damage? The pressure from all sides was building, expectations from the team, whispers from coworkers, the looming threat of retaliation. Everyone had a different opinion, but the employee knew one thing: they couldn't turn back. Turning back would mean surrendering to the bully, accepting that the cycle of mistreatment would go on indefinitely. And that was something they couldn't live with. The manager, meanwhile, didn't seem to back down either. If anything, they ramped up their passive-aggressive tactics. Small things that were hard to pinpoint or prove, but impossible to ignore. Emails were delayed or ignored altogether. Important meetings were scheduled at the last minute, making it impossible for the employee to prepare properly. It felt like they were being edged out, subtly pushed aside, as if the manager was trying to erase them without ever having to make it official. But the employee could feel it, the isolation creeping in. The manager had found a new way to undermine them without ever having to raise their voice. Yet there were those moments when the employee could almost sense a crack in manager's facade. They had seen it: fleeting expressions, small shifts in behavior when no one was watching. A quick glance exchanged with someone who wasn't supposed to notice, a hesitation before the next cruel remark. Could the manager be cracking? Was the pressure they were facing from higher up starting to show? The employee couldn't tell for sure, but they weren't the only one who seemed to notice something wasn't quite right. A few days after the incident, the employee was approached by a coworker. They hadn't spoken much, but employee could tell something was different in the way they looked at them now. It wasn't just the usual polite indifference, it was something more, something that could almost be interpreted as concern. "I saw what happened in that meeting," the coworker said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I know things haven't been easy for you lately. I just wanted you to know. You're not alone in this." The employee's heart skipped a beat. They had heard whispers, rumors that others had noticed the treatment, but this was the first time someone had actually acknowledged it. For a brief moment, it felt like a lifeline, something that reminded them they weren't invisible. They had been a silent witness to the bullying, but now, someone else was offering them solidarity. But the employee also felt a mix of fear and uncertainty. The last thing they wanted was to get anyone else involved, to drag another person into the conflict. The stakes felt too high to risk putting someone else in the line of fire. "I appreciate it," the employee said softly, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "But I don't want you to get involved." The coworker nodded, but there was something in their eyes, something that made the employee feel like they understood more than they were letting on. Before they could say more, the coworker simply gave a small, reassuring smile and walked away. Days passed in the same heavy rhythm. Every conversation felt like it was happening through a thick fog. The employee's mind was consumed with questions, with worries. Were they doing the right thing? Was there another way? But deep down, they knew they couldn't keep their head down, not anymore. They had already started down this path, and now they had to see it through. Then, a strange thing happened. The employee received an unexpected email from HR. It wasn't the usual monthly update or company-wide announcement, it was a meeting request. A one-on-one with HR, no details, just a time and a date. The email felt like a punch to the gut. What did this mean? Why were they being called in? Was this retaliation starting to take form? They tried to shake off the panic, to think logically. But the fear was there, gnawing at their thoughts. The manager had always been close with HR, and they had always been able to control the narrative. What if this was just another move in the game, another step in the manager's strategy to isolate them? The day of the meeting arrived, and the employee sat in HR's office, hands clenched together in their lap. The HR manager, a woman who had always seemed distant and impartial, sat across from them with a clipboard, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on for a moment before she spoke. "I wanted to meet with you to discuss your recent interactions with your manager," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of something that made the employee's stomach tighten. "Has there been a problem?" The HR manager continued. "A conflict or misunderstanding, perhaps?" The employee swallowed hard. They knew this was a critical moment. The words they chose now could shape the direction of everything. But how much should they say? How much was too much? If they spoke out, would it be seen as a personal attack? Or would it finally make someone listen? I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly," the employee said carefully. They couldn't afford to speak in absolutes, not yet. "I'm doing my job, and I'm trying my best, but the feedback I've been receiving. It's been personal. And I don't think it's about the work anymore. The HR manager didn't respond immediately, instead writing something down. The silence was suffocating. The employee could feel their pulse quicken, their thoughts swirling. What was the right thing to say? Was this the moment that would make all the difference, or was it the moment they would regret? Then, as if sensing the employee's hesitation, the HR manager finally spoke again. "I'll look into it," she said, her voice steady. "I'll get back to you soon." The employee left the office with more questions than answers. The meeting had been ambiguous, and nothing felt resolved. The tension in their chest only grew heavier. What would happen now? Would HR really investigate? Or was this just another part of the same system that allowed the manager to get away with everything? All the employee knew was that they couldn't stop now. The stakes had been raised, and no matter what came next, they were going to face it head on. The feeling of being backed into a corner was intense, but it was also liberating. They couldn't go back. This fight wasn't just about them anymore, it was about standing up for everyone who had silently endured the same treatment, about breaking the cycle of fear and intimidation. The next move was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever happened, they weren't going to let this go. The story was far from over. The days following the meeting with HR felt like a time bomb ticking down to an unknown moment. The employee went through their workday as if in a fog, constantly wondering what would happen next. Would they hear back from HR soon? Was the manager aware of the conversation? The uncertainty gnawed at them, creating a storm of questions and worries. Every glance from a coworker, every email from their manager, felt like it was part of a larger scheme they couldn't fully understand. At first, it seemed as though things might settle down. The manager's passive-aggressive remarks were still there, but they didn't escalate in the same way they had before. The silence between them lingered in the halls and meetings, but it was almost like the manager was waiting for something, like they were biding their time. The employee couldn't shake the feeling that something was building behind the scenes, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. It was as if the storm had only momentarily quieted before the real chaos would begin. One afternoon, the employee received an email from HR. Their heart raced as they clicked open the message, bracing themselves for whatever it would say. The email was brief, direct, and unsettling. A meeting was scheduled for the following morning, another one-on-one, but this time with the employee, the manager, and an HR representative. The weight of the email sank in, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a routine follow-up, this was serious. The employee spent the entire evening pacing, replaying every interaction with the manager in their mind, wondering if they had missed something. Were there any signs that could have hinted at what this meeting was really about? Their thoughts spiraled. Was this it? Was the retaliation coming in full force now? The next morning, they arrived early, walking into the conference room with a sense of dread settling in their chest. The HR representative was already there, sitting at the head of the table, her face unreadable. The manager, however, was nowhere to be seen. For a brief moment, the employee felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the manager wasn't going to show up. Maybe they had backed down. But the door opened, and there the manager stood, their expression cold and calculating. It was as if calm before storm had been replaced by an icy certainty. Without a word, the manager took their seat across from the employee, and the HR representative started the meeting with a formal tone. "Thank you both for being here. We are gathered to address ongoing concerns and ensure that we're fostering a productive and respectful working environment. We'll be listening to both sides and working toward a resolution." The HR representative's words sounded so clinical, so detached from the situation, and the employee could barely focus on what she was saying. Their entire attention was on the manager, whose piercing gaze never left them. It felt like the manager was silently daring them to say anything, to make a move, to see if they would crack under the pressure. The employee could almost feel the intensity radiating from the manager, as if they were preparing to unleash everything in a single, devastating blow. The first few minutes passed in tense silence, as the HR representative tried to establish a calm, neutral tone. The manager said nothing. Finally, the HR representative turned to the employee. "We've heard your concerns, and we want to understand how we can help resolve the situation. How do you feel things have been going since our last meeting?" The employee's mind raced. There was no going back now. This was the moment to speak, to bring everything to light, but how much could they really say? Should they hold back, play it safe, or should they take a risk and push for the truth? The thought of exposing everything, the way the manager had undermined them, the way they had been made to feel invisible, was terrifying. But the employee knew they had no other choice. They couldn't keep living in fear of retaliation forever. "I feel like things haven't changed," the employee finally said, their voice steady but tinged with the tension that gripped their chest. "The manager's behavior hasn't improved. In fact, it's gotten worse. I'm being micromanaged, belittled, and my work is constantly questioned, not based on the results, but on personal bias. It's not about the job anymore. It's about power." The manager's expression didn't shift, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. For a long moment, the HR representative didn't speak, allowing the employee's words to hang in the air. The silence felt suffocating, but the employees stood their ground, trying to ignore the adrenaline rushing through their veins. This was the moment to finally be heard. The HR representative nodded slowly, but the manager's response came quickly, sharp and cutting. "This is ridiculous," they said, their voice laced with a barely concealed anger. "I've been nothing but supportive. I've given clear direction, and now this person wants to accuse me of mistreatment? This is a personal attack, not a professional one." The employee's pulse quickened at the manager's words. The attack had begun. The manager wasn't just defending themselves, they were turning the tables, trying to paint the employee as the problem. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Every ounce of confidence the employee had built up over the past few days started to waver. This wasn't just about the workplace anymore, this was a personal battle. The manager was digging in their heels, and the stakes had never felt higher. The HR representative looked between the two, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She had heard both sides now, but it wasn't clear which direction the meeting would go. The employee could see the struggle on her face. She was stuck between the manager, who had influence and power, and the employee, who had gathered the courage to speak out. The employee's mind raced, wondering if anyone would believe them. Could the manager turn the story around enough to make the employee look like the aggressor? They had heard stories before of people who had been silenced, made to feel small. They didn't want to be one of those stories. They couldn't be. The HR representative took a deep breath before turning back to the manager. "I think we need to investigate this further," she said, her tone more tentative than before. "But right now, let's agree to pause any further escalation. We'll review the situation in the coming days and meet again to discuss possible solutions." The manager's eyes narrowed, and they opened their mouth to respond, but then seemed to think better of it, settling into silence instead. The tension in the room was palpable. The employees' heart hammered in their chest as they left the meeting, unsure of what to expect next. The manager's words, their sharp tone, and the way they had tried to twist the situation made everything feel like it was hanging by a thread. The employee had spoken out, but at what cost? As the door closed behind them, the weight of the meeting still sat heavily on their shoulders. This battle was far from over, and if anything, it had just become even more dangerous. Would the manager retaliate now with even more force? Would HR really follow through with their promises, or was this just another way to sweep the issue under the rug? There was only one thing that was certain: the real fight had just begun. The following days were a blur of meetings, emails, and tense silences. The employee couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the calm after the HR meeting was just the beginning of something darker. Their every move felt scrutinized, and despite HR's assurances, they couldn't escape the nagging thought that the manager was biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. It wasn't just about the workplace anymore, it had become a personal war, and the employee felt like they were losing ground. Then, one morning, the unexpected happened. An email notification popped up on the employee's screen, the subject line reading, "Urgent immediate action required." The sender was from a department the employee rarely interacted with, someone from upper management. The message was brief, but its contents were a gut punch. Please be aware that there has been a recent performance review conducted for your role. This evaluation will be discussed in the upcoming all-hands meeting. You're required to attend. The employee's stomach twisted. Performance review? It had been months since their last formal evaluation, and they had no idea that one was in the works. It seemed odd that such an important review would be introduced in an all-hands meeting, especially without any prior warning. The email made it clear that it wasn't a routine evaluation, it felt more like a formal declaration, something that couldn't be ignored. Panic set in as they reread the message. They had been performing well. They had received positive feedback from colleagues and clients alike. What could this review possibly be about? Was this the manager's doing? Could this be an attack on their professional reputation, disguised as a formal evaluation? With a sinking heart, the employee couldn't help but think of the manager's cold, calculating demeanor during the last meeting. Could they be behind this sudden review? Had they somehow manipulated the system to create a narrative where the employee was the one at fault? The possibility was too chilling to ignore. The employee's pulse quickened. They needed to know more. They needed to prepare for whatever was coming next. As the all-hands meeting approached, the employee sat in front of their computer, heart racing. The large virtual meeting room was filled with familiar faces, but today, everything felt different. The manager was seated at the front, an unreadable expression on their face. The employee kept their camera off, not wanting to give away their growing sense of dread. They watched as the meeting proceeded with the usual updates, but their mind was elsewhere, focused on the moment when the review would be brought up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the moment came. The upper manager's voice rang out across the call, crisp and sharp. Now, let's move on to the next agenda item. We have a performance review for one of our team members. Let's discuss. The employee's heart skipped a beat. Every other conversation in the meeting seemed to blur into the background. The upper manager's next words were a blow. We've seen some concerns about productivity, and it has come to our attention that there might be areas for improvement. Specifically, there have been issues with the handling of key projects and communication with the team. The employee's breath caught in their throat. Were they hearing this right? These criticisms felt entirely fabricated, nothing like the positive feedback they had received from coworkers and clients. The employee's mind raced. How could this be happening? Who was behind this? Was it possible that the manager had used their influence to orchestrate this attack on their credibility? The upper manager's voice continued to echo in the employees' ears as they went on to cite a series of vague performance concerns without offering any specific examples. It was as though they were reading from a script, words that felt distant and detached from the truth. The employee tried to follow along, but their thoughts were consumed by a single question: who was doing this? A heavy silence fell over the meeting after the announcement. The employee could feel eyes on them, even though they weren't visible. Their hands were shaking as they typed a quick message to HR, demanding an explanation. They needed answers. But as they hit send, they realized something that sent a chill down their spine. The HR representative had been unusually quiet during the meeting. Had they known about this performance review? Why hadn't they said anything? The tension in the virtual room grew thick. The manager's presence loomed large, their cold stare seemingly directed at the employee even though the camera was off. The words, the accusations, all felt too orchestrated to be a coincidence. Something bigger was unfolding, something that couldn't be ignored. As the meeting drew to a close, the upper manager announced that the employee would be receiving further feedback during a one-on-one session. They didn't give any details or clarification, just a vague promise of discussing next steps. The email came soon after, instructing the employee to join a private video call with both the upper manager and the HR representative at the end of the day. The employee sat there, staring at the email, their mind whirling. Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? Were they being set up for failure? They had been caught in a web they hadn't even realized was being spun around them. As much as they had tried to stand up for themselves, this felt like something bigger, something darker. The manager's grip seemed to extend further than they could have ever imagined. The call arrived later that afternoon. The employee entered the virtual meeting room with their heart pounding in their chest. The upper manager and HR representative were already there, waiting. The atmosphere was cold, professional, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The manager's expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in their eyes that sent a shiver down the employee's spine. So, the upper manager began, "We've reviewed your performance, and we've come to the conclusion that there needs to be a change. Your position here is no longer viable in its current capacity." The words hit like a sledgehammer. The employee's breath caught in their throat. "Wait, what do you mean? What's going on?" They could barely form the words, the shock of the situation making it difficult to process. "We've decided to move forward with a different approach," the upper manager continued, their voice as cold as ever. "We believe it's best for you to step down from your role. Your ongoing performance issues have made it clear that this situation is no longer tenable." The employee's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. After everything they had gone through the meetings with HR, the courage to speak out, it was all being swept away in a single stroke. They had no way of defending themselves. They had no way of proving that they had been targeted. The HR representative remained silent, their face unreadable. The employee could barely focus on what was being said. All they could hear were the manager's cold words echoing in their mind. "Step down." The final blow. But just before the employee could say anything, a surprising twist occurred. The HR representative, who had been silent throughout the meeting, spoke up. "I'm not sure this decision is entirely fair," they said, their voice tentative. "I think we should reconsider." The room froze. It wasn't what the employee had expected. For the first time, the HR representative had sided with them. But why now? What had changed? What was going on behind the scenes that they didn't know about? The employee didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple, unexpected intervention was about to change the course of everything. The tension in the virtual meeting was palpable, as the HR representative's unexpected words hung in the air. The employee could hardly believe what they had just heard. Reconsider? The manager's face tightened, their eyes narrowing, but they didn't immediately respond. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity, leaving the employee in a daze, unsure of what would happen next. For a moment, it seemed like the HR representative was merely trying to buy time. The employee could see the manager's frustration growing, their normally polished demeanor beginning to crack. The employee's heart raced, their mind whirling as they tried to process the shift in the room. Was this a new strategy to discredit them, or was there something more to this? Finally, the manager spoke again, their voice steely. "We don't need to waste time discussing something that's already been decided," they said, clearly trying to take control of the situation. "The decision stands. You're being moved out of your current position." But the HR representative didn't back down. "Actually, after a thorough review of the situation, I believe the decision was made prematurely. I've had a conversation with some of the team members, and there's something we've overlooked. There are details here that we need to address before we move forward." The manager's expression faltered for just a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing their face. The employee could hardly believe their ears. Were they hearing this right? The HR representative was actively challenging the manager's decision? It was unheard of, a move that could cost them their position, and yet they stood their ground. The employee seized on the opportunity. "What exactly do you mean?" they asked, their voice barely a whisper. But it was enough to prompt the HR representative to continue. "There have been concerns raised by other employees, by those who have worked closely with you, that the assessment of your performance wasn't as comprehensive as it should have been. We've received conflicting feedback about the impact you've made on projects and team dynamics. It wasn't fair to base such a significant decision on a one-sided review." The employee's heart soared. This was it. The turning point they had been desperately waiting for. It wasn't just the HR representative's support, it was the acknowledgement that the manager's power over their future was being questioned. The balance of power had shifted, but the fight was far from over. The manager's face darkened as they glared at the HR representative. For a brief moment, it seemed like the confrontation might escalate further. The employee could feel the tension building again, knowing that this was the most critical moment. The resolution they had been hoping for was within reach, but it was still fragile. Finally, the manager let out a tight breath, their shoulders stiffening. "Fine," they said, almost through clenched teeth. "But you're making a mistake." The HR representative nodded. "Perhaps. But the decision isn't final yet. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation into this matter. In the meantime, we'll pause any further action." The employee couldn't believe it. It was over, at least for now. They weren't being let go. They weren't being forced out. They had a chance to prove themselves. The emotional weight they had carried for weeks suddenly seemed to lift. They felt a sense of relief so powerful it almost brought tears to their eyes. But as the meeting wrapped up and they logged off, a thought lingered, one that hadn't fully settled in their mind until now. What had truly been behind this sudden attack on their career? Over the next few days, the employee received an unexpected call from HR, one that would send everything spiraling in a new direction. The HR representative explained that an internal audit had uncovered some troubling discrepancies in the manager's actions. It seemed that, over the past few months, the manager had been manipulating reports and misrepresenting employee performance metrics to push their own agenda. The employee was stunned. They had suspected something was wrong, but to hear that the manager had been actively sabotaging others to maintain control was beyond belief. The manager's hostile behavior, the way they had bullied the employee, was just one small part of a much larger web of deceit and manipulation. The manager had been using their position to push personal vendettas, destroy careers, and cover up their own failures. It was clear now. The manager wasn't just a difficult superior. They were a toxic influence within the company, undermining everything the organization stood for. The employees' confrontation in the meeting had been only the beginning of a much bigger revelation. This wasn't just about one person's career, it was about the culture of the entire company being manipulated from the top down. The news sent shockwaves through the organization. A full investigation was launched, and soon after, the manager was placed on administrative leave. The employee, once a target, now found themselves at the center of a much larger story. The company was forced to confront the toxic leadership that had poisoned its culture for so long. But the twist didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, the employee was approached by a whistleblower from a different department, someone who had been watching the same manager's manipulative tactics for years. They had evidence, crucial evidence that could bring the entire scandal to light. This new revelation suggested that the manager had been involved in several unethical practices, all covered up through manipulation and false reporting. The employee found themselves facing an even bigger decision. They could walk away, leave the chaos behind, and resume their career. Or they could choose to become part of the fight to expose the full extent of the corruption that had tainted the company for so long. The decision weighed heavily on them. It was more than just a matter of career advancement now, it was about standing up for what was right, exposing the truth, and making sure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment they had. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as the employees sat back and thought about everything they had been through, they realized one final truth. This wasn't just about surviving a toxic workplace. It was about taking control of their own narrative, finding their voice, and using it to spark change. What had started as a fight for survival had turned into a battle for justice, and they were ready to fight. As the days passed, the employee wrestled with the decision that lay before them. The new whistleblower's information was damning, but the stakes were higher now. They could feel the weight of it all being thrust into a larger battle that was no longer just about their own job but the integrity of the entire organization. They were not alone in this. They had been given the chance to make a real difference, to expose the corruption that had poisoned the culture from the top down. But with that power came an immense responsibility, and they knew that their choice would reverberate throughout the company, possibly changing the course of their career forever. They spent nights reflecting, analyzing the implications of taking this next step. Every part of them wanted to walk away, to return to the safety of their regular work routine, to let the dust settle and let the higher-ups handle it. But deep down, they knew that walking away would only perpetuate the toxic environment that had held so many others captive. If they chose to fight, there was no going back. The employee reached out to the whistleblower to learn more about the evidence. After a careful, cautious conversation, they agreed to meet in person. The whistleblower was nervous, their hands trembling as they handed over a folder filled with incriminating documents. The contents were shocking email threads, internal reports, even recordings proof that the manager had been systematically targeting employees, manipulating metrics, and leveraging power to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The employee could hardly believe what they were holding. It wasn't just one person's manipulation, it was a coordinated effort to silence dissent and maintain control, a pattern that had lasted for years. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, deeply ingrained system of unethical behavior that reached far beyond the manager in question. The company had been complicit in these actions for too long, turning a blind eye to the toxic practices, and it was now clear that the problem wasn't going to fix itself unless they took bold action. The employee's mind raced as they considered what to do next. Taking this evidence to the higher-ups meant going against a powerful network of individuals who had been involved in these actions. It meant risking their own safety in the workplace, possibly putting their career on the line. But if they stayed silent, they would be part of the problem, contributing to the very thing that had caused so much pain in the first place. In the end, they knew there was no turning back. The employee reached out to a trusted advisor, someone who had been with the company for years and had always been supportive. This person had a strong reputation within the organization, and they were the perfect ally to help guide the employee through the next steps. Together, they decided to take the evidence directly to the company's board of directors, hoping that the sheer volume of proof would be enough to prompt immediate action. The day they walked into that boardroom was nerve-wracking. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of what was about to unfold felt almost suffocating. The employees stood before the board, their heart pounding in their chest, as they presented the evidence they had gathered. The room was silent as the documents were passed around, every pair of eyes fixed on the pages. It was as if time stood still, the truth laid bare for the first time. The reaction from the board was swift, and it was nothing short of shocking. They listened intently, absorbing every detail, their expressions unreadable. When they finished reviewing the evidence, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. There were hushed conversations, a flurry of calls being made, and the unmistakable sound of actions being taken. For the employee, it was both a moment of victory and deep uncertainty. What would happen next? Would the organization stand by them? Would they be dragged into a larger web of corporate politics they couldn't escape from? The response came quickly. The board issued an official statement acknowledging the findings, confirming the manager's removal, and announcing a company-wide investigation into the broader culture of misconduct. The company was going to change, or at least, that's what the statement said. There was an immediate restructuring of leadership, with an external consulting firm brought in to help guide the company through a cultural overhaul. It wasn't perfect, and the road to true transformation would be long, but for the first time, the company seemed committed to making real, lasting changes. For the employee, the road wasn't as smooth as they'd hoped. While they had been instrumental in exposing the truth, their role in the process wasn't without consequences. Some colleagues whispered, others avoided eye contact, and there were moments when the employee felt like an outsider in their own workplace. The support they had expected didn't always materialize in the way they had hoped. They had made powerful enemies in the process, and the fight wasn't over. The aftermath of exposing such deep-seated corruption was never going to be without repercussions. But the employee had done something they could be proud of. They had stood up when it mattered, and their actions had ignited a spark of change. Over the coming months, things began to improve, albeit slowly. The toxic atmosphere that had once dominated the workplace started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of transparency and accountability. People began to feel safe speaking up, and slowly, trust was rebuilt, though it would take time to heal all the wounds. For the employee, the ultimate reward came not in the form of accolades or recognition, but in the quiet knowledge that they had made a difference. Their courage had sparked a ripple effect, one that would continue long after the dust had settled. They had become an unwitting hero, not through grand gestures, but through their refusal to accept a toxic workplace and their determination to challenge the status quo. As the company moved forward, the employee found themselves at a crossroads. They had fought the good fight, but the journey wasn't over. The lessons they had learned about standing up for what was right, about the power of one voice, and about the importance of accountability would stay with them forever. The fight for justice in the workplace wasn't something that ended with one victory. It was an ongoing commitment to creating spaces where everyone could thrive, free from fear and discrimination. Looking back, the employee could see the journey for what it was, not just a personal battle, but a collective one. The struggle had brought people together, united them in the face of adversity, and shown them the true strength of solidarity. The change was happening, not just in the company, but in every individual who had witnessed or been touched by the events. In the end, the employee knew they had made the right choice. They had fought not just for themselves but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or oppressed. They had rewritten their story, and in doing so, they had given others the courage to rewrite theirs. And in the quiet moments of reflection, when they thought about everything that had happened, they realized that sometimes, the greatest victories weren't the ones celebrated in public but the ones fought in the silence of the soul. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.